J.D. Salinger's 9 Stories, Daumier-Smith's Blue Period. If it made any real sense, and it doesn't even begin to, I think I might be inclined to dedicate this account, for whatever it's worth, especially if it's the least bit ribald in parts, to the memory of my late ribald stepfather, Robert Aganian, Jr. Bobby, as everyone, even I, called him, died in 1947, surely with a few regrets, but without a single gripe of thrombosis. He was an adventurous, extremely magnetic and generous man. After having spent so many years laboriously begrudging him those Carr-esque adjectives, I feel it's a matter of life and death to get them in here. My mother and father were divorced during the winter of 1928, when I was 8, and mother married Bobby Aganian late that spring. A year later, in the Wall Street crash, Bobby lost everything he and mother had, with the exception, apparently, of a magic wand. In any case, practically overnight, Bobby turned himself from a dead stockbroker and incapacitated bon vivant into a live, if somewhat unqualified, agent appraiser for a society of independent American art galleries and fine arts museums. A few weeks later, early in 1930, our rather mixed threesome moved from New York to Paris, the better for Bobby to ply his new trade. Being a cool, not to say an ice-cold 10 at the time, I took the big move, so far as I know, untraumatically. It was the move back to New York 9 years later, 3 months after my mother died, that threw me, and threw me terribly. I remember a significant incident that occurred just a day or two after Bobby and I arrived in New York. I was standing up in a very crowded Lexington Avenue bus, holding on to the enamel pole near the driver's seat, buttocks to buttocks with the chap behind me. For a number of blocks the driver had repeatedly given those of us bunched up near the front door a curt order to step to the rear of the vehicle. Some of us had tried to oblige him, some of us hadn't. At length, with a red light in his favor, the harassed man swung around in his seat and looked up at me, just behind him. At 19, I was a hatless type, with a flat, black, not particularly clean, continental-type pompadour over a badly broken-out inch of forehead. He addressed me in a lowered and almost prudent tone of voice. "All right, buddy," he said, "let's move that ass." It was the buddy, I think, that did it. Without even bothering to bend over a little, that is, to keep the conversation at least as private, as de bon goût, as he'd kept it, I informed him in French that he was rude, stupid, overbearing imbecile, and that he'd never know how much I detested him. Then, rather elated, I stepped to the rear of the vehicle. Things got much worse. One afternoon, a week or so later, as I was coming out of the Ritz Hotel, where Bobby and I were indefinitely stopping, it seemed to me that all the seats from all the buses in New York had been unscrewed and taken out and set up in the street, where a monstrous game of musical chairs was in full swing. I think I might have been willing to join the game if I had been granted a special dispensation from the Church of Manhattan, guaranteeing that all other players would remain respectfully standing till I was seated. When it became clear that nothing of the kind was forthcoming, I took more direct action. I prayed for the city to be cleared of people, for the gift of being alone, A-L-O-N-E, which is the one New York prayer that rarely gets lost or delayed in channels, and in no time at all everything I touched turned to solid loneliness. Mornings and early afternoons I attended, bodily, an art school on 48th and Lexington Avenue. which I loathed. The week before Bobby and I had left Paris, I had won 3 first prize awards at the National Junior Exhibition held at the Friedberg Galleries. Throughout the voyage to America, I used our stateroom mirror to note my uncanny physical resemblance to El Greco. 3 late afternoons a week I spent in a dentist chair where, within a period of few months, I had 8 teeth extracted, 3 of them front ones. The other 2 afternoons I usually spent wandering through art galleries, mostly on 57th Street, where I did all but hiss at the American entries. Evenings I generally read. I bought a complete set of the Harvard classics, chiefly because Bobby said we didn't have room for them in our suite, and rather perversely read all 50 volumes. Nights I almost invariably set up my easel between the twin beds in the room I shared with Bobby and painted. In 1 month alone, according to my diary from 1939, I completed 18 oil paintings. Noteworthy enough, 17 of them were self-portraits. Sometimes, however, possibly when my muse was being capricious, I set aside my paints and drew cartoons. One of them I still have. It shows the cavernous view of the mouth of a man being attended by his dentist. The man's tongue is a simple U.S. Treasury $100 bill, and the dentist is saying sadly in French, "I think we can save the molar, but I'm afraid that tongue will have to come out." It was an enormous favorite of mine. As roommates, Bobby and I were neither more nor less compatible than would be, say, an exceptionally live and let live Harvard senior and an exceptionally unpleasant Cambridge newsboy. And when, as the weeks went by, we gradually discovered that we were both in love with the same deceased woman, it was no help at all. In fact, a ghastly little after you, Alphonse, relationship grew out of the discovery. We began to exchange vivacious smiles when we bumped into each other on the threshold of the bathroom. One week in May of 1940, about 10 months after Bobby and I checked into the Ritz, I saw in a Quebec newspaper, one of 16 French-language newspapers and periodicals I had blown myself a subscription to, a quarter-column advertisement that had been placed by the direction of a Montreal correspondence art school. It advised all qualified instructors, it as much as said, in fact, that it couldn't advise them, for it meant enough, to apply immediately for employment at the newest, most progressive correspondence art school in Canada. Candidate instructors, it stipulated, were to have a fluent knowledge of both the French and English languages, and only those of temperate habits and unquestionable character need apply. The summer session at Les Amis de Beaux Maîtres was officially to open 10 June. Samples of work, it said, should represent both the academic and commercial fields of art, and were to be submitted to Monsieur I. Yoshoto, Directeur, formerly of the Imperial Academy of Fine Arts, Tokyo. Instantly feeling almost insupportably qualified, I got out Bobby's Hermes Baby typewriter from under his bed and wrote in French a long, intemperate letter to M. Yoshoto, cutting all my morning classes at the art school on Lexington Avenue to do it. My opening paragraph ran some 3 pages and very nearly smoked. I said I was 29 and a great-nephew of Daumier-Smith. I said I had just left my small estate in the south of France following the death of my wife to come to America to stay temporarily. I made it clear with an invalid relative. I had been painting, I said, since early childhood, but that following the advice of Pablo Picasso, who was one of the oldest and dearest friends of my parents, I had never exhibited. However, a number of my oil paintings and watercolors were now hanging in some of the finest and by no means nouveau riche homes in Paris, where they had gained considerable attention from some of the most formidable critics of our day. Following, I said, my wife's untimely and tragic death of an ulceration cancerous, I had earnestly thought I would never again set brush to canvas, but recent financial losses had led me to alter my earnest resolution. I said I would be most honored to submit samples of my work to Les Amis de Vous Maîtres just as soon as they were sent to me by my agent in Paris, to whom I would write, of course, très presse. I remained most respectfully Jean de Daumier-Smith. It took me almost as long to select a pseudonym as it had taken me to write the whole letter. I wrote the letter on overlaid tissue paper. However, I sealed it in a Ritz envelope. Then, after applying a special delivery stamp I'd found in Bobby's top drawer, I took the letter down to the main mail drop in the lobby. Stopped on the way to put the mail clerk, who unmistakably loathed me, on the alert for a de Daumier-Smith's future incoming mail. Then around 2:30 I slipped into my 145 anatomy class at the art school on 48th Street. My classmates seemed, for the first time, like a fairly decent bunch. During the next 4 days, using all my spare time plus some time that didn't quite belong to me, I drew a dozen or more samples of what I thought were typical examples of American commercial art, working mostly in washes but occasionally to show off in line. I drew people in evening clothes stepping out of limousines on opening nights, lean, erect, super chic couples who had obviously never in their lives inflicted suffering as a result of underarm carelessness. Couples, in fact, who perhaps didn't have any underarms. I drew sun-tanned young giants in white dinner jackets, seated at white tables alongside turquoise swimming pools, toasting each other rather excitedly with highballs made from a cheap but ostensibly ultra-fashionable brand of rye whiskey. I drew ruddy, billboard-genic children beside themselves with delight and good health, holding up their empty bowls of breakfast food and pleading good-naturedly for more. I drew laughing, high-breasted girls aquaplaning without a care in the world, as a result of being amply protected against such national evils as bleeding gums, facial blemishes, unsightly hairs, and faulty or inadequate life insurance. I drew housewives who, until they reached for the right soap flakes, laid themselves wide open to straggly hair, poor posture, unruly children, disaffected husbands, rough but slender hands, untidy but enormous kitchens. When the samples were finished, I mailed them immediately to M. Yashoto, along with a half dozen or so non-commercial paintings of mine that I'd brought with me from France. I also enclosed what I thought was a very casual note that only just began to tell the richly human little story of how, quite alone and variously handicapped in the purest romantic tradition, I had reached the cold, white, isolating summits of my profession. The next few days were horribly suspenseful, but before the week was out, A letter came from M. Yashoda accepting me as an instructor at Les Amis de Biométrie. The letter was written in English even though I had written in French. I later gathered that M. Yashoda, who knew French but not English, had for some reason assigned the writing of the letter to Mademoiselle Yashoda, who had some working knowledge of English. M. Yashoda said that the summer session would probably be the busiest session of the year, and that it started on 24 June. This gave me almost 5 weeks, he pointed out, to settle my affairs. He offered me his unlimited sympathy for, in effect, my recent emotional and financial setbacks. He hoped that I would arrange myself to report at Les Amis de Biométrie on Sunday, 23 June, in order to learn of my duties and to become firm friends with the other instructors, who I later learned were 2 in number, and consisted of M. Yashoda and Mademoiselle Yashoda. He deeply regretted that it was not the school's policy to advance transportation fare to new instructors. Starting salary was $28 a week, which was not, M. Yashoda said he realized, a very large sum of funds, but since it included bed and nourishing food, and since he sensed in me the true vacationary spirit, he hoped I would not feel cast down with vigor. He awaited a telegram of formal acceptance from me with eagerness, and my arrival with a spirit of pleasantness, and remained sincerely my new friend and employer, I. Yashoda, formerly of the Imperial Academy of Fine Arts, Tokyo. My telegram of formal acceptance went out within 5 minutes. Oddly enough, in my excitement, or quite possibly from a feeling of guilt because I was using Bobby's phone to send the wire, I deliberately sat on my prose and kept the message down to 10 words. That evening, when, as usual, I met Bobby for dinner at 7 o'clock in the Oval Room, I was annoyed to see that he'd brought a guest along. I hadn't said or implied a word to him about my recent extracurricular doings, and I was dying to make this final news break, to scoop him thoroughly when we were alone. The guest was a very attractive young lady, then only a few months divorced, whom Bobby had been seeing a lot of and whom I'd met on several occasions. She was an altogether charming person whose every attempt to be friendly to me, to gently persuade me to take off my armor, or at least my helmet, I chose to interpret as an implied invitation to join her in bed at my earliest convenience. That is, as soon as Bobby, who clearly was too old for her, could be given the slip. I was hostile and laconic throughout dinner. At length, while we were having coffee, I tersely outlined my new plans for the summer. When I'd finished, Bobby put a couple quite intelligent questions to me. I answered them coolly, overly briefly, the unimpeachable crown prince of the situation. "Oh, it sounds very exciting," said Bobby's guest, and waited wantonly for me to slip her my Montreal address under the table. "I thought you were going to Rhode Island with me," Bobby said. "Oh, darling, don't be a horrible wet blanket," Mrs. X said to him. "I'm not, but I wouldn't mind knowing a little more about it," Bobby said. But I thought I could tell from his manner that he was already mentally exchanging his train reservations for Rhode Island from a compartment to a lower berth. "I think it's the sweetest, most complimentary thing I ever heard in my life," Mrs. X said warmly to me. Her eyes sparkled with depravity. The Sunday that I stepped on the platform at Windsor Station in Montreal, I was wearing a double-breasted beige gabardine suit that I had a damned high opinion of. a navy blue flannel shirt, a solid yellow cotton tie, brown and white shoes, Panama hat that belonged to Bobby and was rather too small for me, and a reddish-brown mustache, aged 3 weeks. M. Yashodo was there to meet me. He was a tiny man, not more than 5 feet tall, wearing a rather soiled linen suit, black shoes, and a black felt hat, with the brim turned up all around. He neither smiled nor, as I remember, said anything to me as we shook hands. His expression, my word for it, came straight out of a French edition of Saxe Rohmer's Fu Manchu books, was inscrutable. For some reason, I was smiling from ear to ear. I couldn't even turn it down, let alone off. It was a bus ride for several miles from Windsor Station to the school. I doubt if M. Yashodo had 5 words the whole way. Either in spite or because of his silence, I talked incessantly, with my legs crossed, ankle to knee, and constantly using my sock as an absorber for perspiration on my palm. It seemed urgent to me not only to reiterate my earlier lies about my kinship with Daumier, about my deceased wife, about my small estate in the south of France, but to elaborate on them at length, in effect to spare myself from dwelling on these painful reminiscences. And they were beginning to feel a little painful. I swung over to the subject of my parents' oldest and dearest friend, Pablo Picasso, Le Pauvre Picasso, as I referred to him. I picked Picasso, I might mention, because he seemed to me the French painter who was best known in America. I roundly considered Canada part of America. For M. Yashodo's benefit, I recalled with a showy amount of natural compassion for a fallen giant how many times I had said to him, "Mais, M. Picasso, oy allez-vous?" and how, in response to this all-penetrating question, the master had never failed to walk slowly, leadenly, across his studio to look at a small reproduction of his Les Saltimbanques, and the glory long forfeited that had been this. The trouble with Picasso, I explained to M. Yashodo, as we got out of the bus, was that he never listened to anybody, even his closest friends. In 1939, Les Amis de Vous Metri occupied the second floor of a small, highly unendowed-looking 3-story building, a tenant building, really, in the Verdun, or at least attractive, section of Montreal. The school was directly over an orthopedic appliance shop. One large room and a tiny, boltless latrine were all there was to Les Amis de Vous Metri itself. Nonetheless, the moment I was inside, the place seemed wondrously presentable to me. There was a very good reason. The walls of the instructor's room were hung with many framed pictures, all watercolors done by M. Yashodo. Occasionally I still dream of a certain white goose flying through an extremely pale blue sky with, and it was one of the most daring and accomplished feats of craftsmanship I'd ever seen, the blueness of the sky, or the ethos of the blueness of the sky, reflected in the bird's feathers. The picture was hung just behind Mademoiselle Yashodo's desk. It made the room, it and one of 2 other pictures, close to its quality. Mademoiselle Yashodo, in a beautiful black and cerise silk kimono, was sweeping the floor with a short-handled broom when Monsieur Yashodo and I entered the instructor's room. She was a gray-haired woman, surely a head taller than her husband, with features that looked rather more Malayan than Japanese. She left off sweeping and came forward. Monsieur Yashodo briefly introduced us. She seemed to me every bit as inscrutable as Monsieur Yashodo, if not more so. Monsieur Yashodo then offered to show me to my room, which he explained, in French, had recently been vacated by his son, who had gone to British Columbia to work on a farm. After his long silence in the bus, I was grateful to hear him speak with any continuity, and I listened rather vivaciously. He started to apologize for the fact that there were no chairs in his son's room, only floor cushions, but I quickly gave him to believe that for me this was little short of a godsend. In fact, I think I said I hated chairs. I was so nervous that if he had informed me that his son's room was flooded night and day with a foot of water, I probably would have let out a little cry of pleasure. I probably would have said I had a rare foot disease, one that required me keeping my feet wet 8 hours daily. Then he led me up a creaky wooden staircase to my room. I told him on the way, pointedly enough, that I was a student of Buddhism. I later found out that both he and Mademoiselle Yashodo were Presbyterians. Late that night, as I lay awake in bed, with Mademoiselle Yashodo's Japanese Malayan dinner still en masse and riding my sternum like an elevator, one or the other of the Yashodos began to moan in his or her sleep, just the other side of my wall. It was a high, thin, broken moan, and it seemed to come less from an adult than from either a tragic, subnormal infant or a small, malformed animal. It became a regular nightly performance. I never did find out which of the Yashodos it came from, let alone why. When it became quite unendurable to listen to from a supine position, I got out of bed, put on my slippers, and went over in the dark and sat on one of the floor cushions. I sat cross-legged for a couple hours and smoked cigarettes, squashing them out on the instep of my slipper and putting the stubs in the breast pocket of my pajamas. The Yashodos didn't smoke, and there were no ashtrays anywhere on the premises. I got to sleep around 5 in the morning. At 6:30, Monsieur Yashodo knocked on my door and advised me that breakfast would be served at 6:45. He asked me through the door if I had slept well, and I answered, "Oui." I then dressed, putting on my blue suit, which I thought appropriate for an instructor on the opening day of school, and a red sulka tie my mother had given me, and without washing, hurried down the hall to the Yashodo's kitchen. Mademoiselle Yashodo was at the stove preparing a fish breakfast. Monsieur Yashodo, in his BVDs and trousers, was seated at the kitchen table reading a Japanese newspaper. He nodded to me noncommittally. Neither of them had ever looked more inscrutable. Presently, some sort of fish was served to me on a plate with a small but noticeable trace of coagulated catsup along the border. Mademoiselle Yashodo asked me in English, and her accent was unexpectedly charming, if I would prefer an egg, but I said, "Non, non, madame, merci." I said I never ate eggs. Monsieur Yashodo leaned his newspaper against my water glass, and the three of us ate in silence. That is, they ate, and I systematically swallowed in silence. After breakfast, without having to leave the kitchen, Monsieur Yashodo put on a collarless shirt, and Mademoiselle Yashodo took off her apron, and the three of us filed rather awkwardly downstairs to the instructor's room. There, in an untidy pile on Monsieur Yashodo's broad desk, lay some dozen or more unopened, enormous, bulging manila envelopes. To me, they had almost freshly brushed and combed looked like new pupils. Monsieur Yashodo signed me to my desk. which was on the far isolated side of the room, and asked me to be seated. Then, with